Welcome to Property Power Talks, the exclusive podcast for NB Property Law. I'm your host, Kaylee Swift, and each episode will dive into cutting-edge insights on property law, probate, estate planning strategies, and seamless estate administration. Whether you're a property investor, homeowner, industry professional, planning your estate, or wanting to understand how estate administrations work, then our expert discussions will empower you with the knowledge you need to navigate the complexities of property and estate planning law with confidence. Let's unlock the power of property and estate planning law together. All right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Kaylee Swift. I'm one of the directors here at NB Property Law, and we've got our guest presenter, Adrian Hanson from Ascent Property Finance, and he's a senior mortgage broker there. So thank you, Adrian, for joining us.
Thanks,
So this morning, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in a second, and I'll do so. But we've got our webinar today will be about making smarter commercial property decisions. So talking about structures, finance, and also investing. So a little bit about myself and NB Property Law. So as I mentioned, I'm one of the directors here. Essentially, I showcase my expertise across both commercial property and also estate planning law. I like to work closely with individuals, families, and also business owners to help them navigate their complex property transactions, their commercial contracts, and also thinking about their long-term asset protection strategies in terms of estate planning. So I've got extensive experience across estate planning and commercial law, but I also do advise clients on their wills, testamentary trusts, and their asset structuring and succession planning. So we do this to make sure that our clients' wealth and their business interests are actually protected both now, but also into the future. So I've got a combined commercial and property law background, and that actually enables me to be able to deliver that integrated strategic advice to help support my clients' business growth, manage their risk, and also look at their long-term wealth preservation. I'm passionate about commercial estate and planning law and also property law, but I do also strive to make sure I'm providing holistic, practical legal advice aligned with what my clients' broad actual financial and business objective are. But essentially, above everything else, I do prioritize actually delivering advice to my clients in clear commercial terms so that they can ensure that they're smooth transactions and the outcomes are actually going to genuinely support their success, both as an individual and in their business. So I'll pass over to Adrian. If you can introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name's Adrian. I'm a finance broker for Ascent Property Finance. I've been in the finance industry for the last 7 odd years. So I've spent about 5 years in commercial banking at one of the big 4 banks. And then from about the 1st of January 2025, I divvied off into mortgage broking. One of the main reasons is that I knew exactly what my clients were wanting, and sometimes what they needed didn't fit our policy, but I knew exactly what our competitors were doing. And fortunately, 9 times out of 10, the competitor, it was actually better off for the client to go to. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of branch off into mortgage broking. And about 3 months ago, we started Ascent Property Finance to essentially assist our clients from more of a strategic point of view. A lot of our clients are investors as well as business owners. My kind of bread and butter are business owners who are essentially looking to invest. We find that a lot of our clients, a lot of business owners will invest in their business, but they don't invest outside of their business. So when they're ready to retire, unfortunately, they don't have much to show for it unless they get a pretty attractive multiplier. So we provide more strategic, conversations surrounding investing inside and outside the business. And commercial property is definitely a ticket item that we talk a lot about. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Adrian. So what we're going to go through today is, firstly, we're going to talk about commercial property finance options and the lending pathways, which Adrian will speak to you about. We'll talk about ownership structures, including companies, trusts, and also self-managed super funds. We'll go through, what are deposits, bank guarantees, fit outs, and working capital in terms of commercial retail leases. In regards to commercial property, we'll be speaking about what are the investment benefits, but also the risks in investing in commercial property. We'll go through the legal checks that you need to be aware of before actually signing a commercial purchase contract. And lastly, we'll speak about some of the key commercial clauses to be aware of with retail and commercial leases. So to start off with, I'm going to talk a little bit about, the legal checks to put in place and be aware of before actually signing a commercial property purchase contract. So purchasing or selling commercial property, it's a big investment decision, which you should be seeking advice from experienced professionals before actually going ahead and, signing contracts. So that's, speaking to a solicitor, speaking to the likes of Adrian as a finance broker, also your accountant, to make sure that, you've got the right structure in place before actually signing off on this legally binding contract. With commercial contracts, they don't have a cooling off period generally. So, you're not subject to just, if it's an unconditional, if there's no other condition on the contract, once you sign it, it will be unconditional. So it's important to make sure that you're also getting the buying entity correct at the outset, which, as I mentioned, might be a reason to speak with your accountant, potentially even your finance broker, because you might have set up a new entity wanting to borrow under that, and that probably may not be likely or possible. Some of the standard conditions, though, that will or can be, or that are included in the what we call the Real Estate Institute of Queensland commercial property contract, that they're subject to, but it's up to you if you enact them, in terms of letting the agent, or if it's the seller's solicitor directly drafting the contract, what timeframes you want around them, is finance. So that's obviously a good one to have in place if you are actually seeking finance. So you've got an option to terminate the contract should you not actually get that formal finance approval. Building and pest inspection. So unless you've done one prior to entering to the contract, always a good idea to make the contract subject to that. You can actually add, additional options for, a plumbing inspection and potentially an electrical inspection as well, if needed. Sometimes sellers may provide a building and pest inspection report. I tell clients, if they're buying, we don't know how biased that report is. You're best to get your own building and pest inspector to undertake your own inspection. You can rely on that a lot more easily than if the property is part of a body corporate inspection of record search is always a good idea. If it's a brand new property, or a few years old, maybe not so much necessary. But anything beyond that, it is a good idea to make sure you're getting that body corporate records inspection search, and obviously making the contract subject to it, as it can come up and reveal a lot of things about the property that you otherwise wouldn't know. Whether there's dispute with neighbouring properties within that body corporate, if there's special levies that have got to be struck for works and there's not enough money in the sinking fund, so all of a sudden you're going to be up, for big amounts of money to cover these repairs that have got to be done. There's some of the things that have been brought up that our clients have then been able to terminate contracts under. Obviously, another key one is actually the settlement date. So, you need to make sure that you've got enough time to do all your checks and get everything in order before the property actually settles. The other important thing to check with commercial property contracts are leases and service agreements, if there's any included. If there are those types of agreements in place, making sure actually you're reviewing the terms of those documents as well, so you're familiar with them, because you'll essentially inherit them as the new owner. With GST, with commercial properties, it's also need to be aware, how that's calculated, who's paying for what. So with GST, is it payable by the seller? Generally, yes, unless there's actually an exemption that applies. So it must be determined prior to the contract being executed as to how GST will be dealt with. And if a seller is registered for GST, they must actually provide the buyer with a GST tax invoice to allow them to claim a credit for GST on the purchase price. So within the standard REIQ contract, there are a few options for how GST can be dealt with. The first one is the property being sold as a going concern, where there is no GST payable on the purchase price. Generally, this option will be used if there's a lease involved. So if there's a lease over the property, that's a going concern, and therefore there won't be GST payable on the purchase price. The seller, if GST is applicable, they can choose to adopt the margin scheme, where the purchase price includes the seller's GST amount for the actual property. another option is whether the purchase price does not include GST. So meaning the buyer then is responsible for paying an extra 10% at settlement of the purchase price to cover that GST amount. Or lastly, the purchase price just does include the GST component. So important to be aware of that. Don't want to be caught out, if the purchase price is plus GST and you've not budgeted for that amount. Now, looking at controlling and protecting your commercial property. So there are various ways that the property can be purchased, and these include, some of the following options. So you can purchase the property obviously in your personal name or names. There could be multiple people purchasing that property. If it is joint names, it could be a partnership if more than one. And there's options you can own as joint tenants or tenants in common, depending on what you prefer. You may look to purchase in a company name. You could have a trust option, so a family or discretionary trust where you personally, as the individual, the trustee. Otherwise, you could have a corporate trustee involved where the company's the one controlling that trust. And then the last option there we've got listed is the self-managed super fund where the purchaser is the trustee, or it could be a company of the members for that fund. And yeah, different options there. Like I said, good idea to be speaking to your finance broker and your accountant to work out which option is the most viable for you and making sure you get it right at the outset of the contract. If you settle, you could have to pay transfer duty again to transfer the property to the correct entity. If you do it once the contract's signed, there'll still be small legal fees for a deed of rescission to be done up by the seller's solicitor, and a new contract entered into. So important to make sure you're getting that right at the outset. Now, other things to be aware of when purchasing commercial property, the risk. So with the REOQ contract, there's a standard condition that outlines that the property will be at the buyer's risk from 5 p.m. on the next business day after the contract is signed. So it's important to remember that and make sure as a buyer that you're getting insurance put in place as soon as you sign that contract, basically. Now, settlement adjustments. So the purchase price payable at settlement will be adjusted on a pro rata basis to take into account factors including outgoings, which could be rent, land tax, council rates, water rates, and body corporate levies. So land tax can be a big one. Like that can be quite a big adjustment, which is generally residential property land tax is not adjusted for, whereas commercial properties usually is. So we need to make sure we've budgeted for that as well. And the other big cost component for the commercial property purchases is the transfer duty, which some people know formally as stamp duty, should I say. And this will be payable at settlement, and it's calculated based on what the purchase price is. Now, a good special condition to include with commercial contracts is a due diligence clause. So the due diligence special condition, it's critical to safeguard buyers. So it allows them to actually conduct searches, review contracts, any financial information, and actually assess the risks of the property before proceeding to an unconditional purchase. So things that could be checked during this due diligence search period could be what is the intended use actually lawful? What, maybe they're going to go run a business out of there. Can they actually do that given the zoning of the property? Any environmental concerns, so asbestos register, having a look through that, making sure it's all, okay, the land's not contaminated, things like that. If there are any compliance concerns, so this could include like the zoning and any building approvals for structures that are located on the property. Looking at the income and expenses relating to the property, so things such as, what the land tax bill might be, upcoming, like I said, body corporate levies that are going to be struck that we've got to pay for. And then also looking at any proposed future plans that you've got and looking to see whether they're actually going to be viable, especially if you're looking to redevelop that property. You may need to look to do a material change of use to be able to actually enact that development plan. And then anything else that may be a concern of you to you, you can basically look into further during that due diligence period. So some of the common legal mistakes we see clients making when buying a commercial property is they're signing the contracts without getting an actual legal review done first. They're failing to conduct due diligence, and then when push comes to shove, they can't do what they want to do with the property, or things are revealed that they weren't aware of. Sometimes they've relied on some verbal representations that might have been given by the selling agent that are not in fact true. They've failed to look at the actual lease and ignored the details of the lease. They've overlooked like the personal guarantee risk. So if they've entered into a contract and they've gone as a company and they've gone as a personal guarantee for that, they've purchased the property often in an unsuitable ownership structure. As I mentioned, there's extra cost then to resolve that and rectify that issue. Or they're just not ensuring that there's sufficient time to satisfy the conditions. Agents said, oh yeah, 7 days finance is fine. And agents like, no, we're going to need at least 21. Like this self-managed super fund takes a lot longer. So yeah, just some of the things that we see pop up from time to time. Now, when there are leases involved in a commercial property, you inherit that lease unless it's for a period. You can basically, with a lease, unless it's registered on title and it's greater than 3 years, as the landlord or the incoming buyer of that property, you've got to basically take on that lease, and you can't just terminate the tenants because you're a new owner. So with the lease, it's the mistakes we see is if you've not actually reviewed what the rent amount is. We've had clients where they've not gone and checked what the expiry date on the lease is. If they've relied on, again, some verbal representations that have been given from the agent about the lease, they've not gone and done their own due diligence, actually checked what the option periods are in the lease. So, they might think, oh, it's only got a year left, but all of a sudden, there's another 3-year option period or 2 3-year option periods. They're assuming that they can redevelop the property. A lot of leases will include a redevelopment clause. So, we give the lessee a notice period and we can terminate the lease to redevelop. Unless that's in the lease, you can't just do that. Failing to understand how the rent increase methodologies actually works. Is it CPI? Have we got turnover rent? What is the mechanism there? And not checking that the actual rent and outgoings are paid. The tenant could be, in huge arrears and the sellers, trying to recoup that money but having no success. Do you really want to be inheriting that problem? Some of the other things that can come up is not confirming what the security held is. So, is there actually any security held, a deposit or bank guarantee or cash bond, whatever it might be. Not checking what is considered as an outgoing. So, can you actually charge all the outgoings, land tax, council rates and things like that? Or are you restricted, or is it a percentage amount that is being charged? Assuming that the tenant will be required to make good the premises at the end of the lease. Again, unless it's stipulated in there, it's not a requirement. Not understanding who's actually responsible for maintenance and repairs. They're things that pop up all the time. We need to be aware of who is responsible for doing them. Overlooking the assignment and subletting clauses. So does the lessee have the right to assign the lease to someone else, and what are the conditions around that? Not checking for any ongoing disputes that there could be in the midst between the current seller of the property, who's the landlord, and the existing tenant, or even with their neighbouring properties. And lastly, not checking if it is actually a commercial lease or retail shop lease. There are different laws applied to these two leases, so it is important to be aware, because there's certain things you can and can't do with both those leases. So what you do need to make sure that you're doing then, if you are purchasing commercial property that's got a lease, is checking if there are any rent incentives. So there could be a rent incentive on foot that you're not getting paid rent for. Maybe they've given a 12-month incentive, they're only 3 months into it. Check what the option periods are, making sure you're actually fully reviewing that lease, ideally by a solicitor who's legally trained to provide that advice. Check when the options need to be exercised, once you're an owner, diarising them so you can be aware of that period. If the tenant doesn't take them up, then obviously you have the right to then get rid of them. Check when notice has been given to the tenants, if like the period of notice that's needed, if there is a redevelopment clause in there, and how long you have to do that. Make sure that the rent increase methods are what has been promised. So, the agents told you, the rent's this amount, but it increases by 5% per annum. Make sure you check that. Is that what's actually included in the lease that's been signed? And getting evidence that the tenant's up to date with their payments, getting rental ledgers to show that, yes, they are compliant with the lease terms and paid everything to date. Making sure you get copies of the bank guarantee or evidence that the actual security bond is held and it's actually the correct amount. To need to make sure that you're understanding what what you can recover from the tenants under the outgoings, so that you can work out then what your cash flow is going to be, what you're going to need to put into the property. Review the lease to confirm that the tenants make good obligations actually are. Making sure that you're understanding what the tenant's responsible for and what you as the landlord will be inheriting as your responsibilities. Going through the assignment and subletting clauses to ensure that they get enforced if you're requested by the lessee for that to be enacted. If it is a retail shop lease, asking for an actual copy of the disclosure that was given, and seeing if there's any outstanding claims or rent disputes, any court proceedings, or any breaches of the lease notices that have been given to the existing tenant. And lastly, making sure that the lease is actually reviewed to ensure it actually meets your requirements as the buyer, as a buyer of that property, and you can be comfortable in knowing what you're investing into. Now, with the leases, it's an important document that's basically going to dictate, what are the main terms of the tenants and lessees' obligations. We want that all in writing in the lease document signed off on by both parties. So in terms of lease terms and option periods, so we need to basically outline, what is the initial lease duration, and the tenant's options for renewing that lease. And if there is the option to renew, how do they go about doing that, and what notice do they need to provide to renew that lease? If there isn't an assignment and subletting clause, it should be dictating what the rights to transfer or sublease that property is and what requirements are needed from the landlord to consent to that. Generally, landlord can't withhold their consent. They've got to reasonably give consent to that transfer, provided the incoming tenant, is legally and financially compliant. What are the release of outgoing tenant obligations? So, if we are assigning the lease, making sure, the tenant's paid everything up to date, they're not in breach of the lease, etc. Another key clause is the default and termination right. So, when does a rent default provision actually come into play? So basically, if they haven't paid rent within 7 days from the due date, or they've failed to, maintain the property as per the lease guidelines. And then what are the requirements for actually breaching that tenant? So, do we give them 28 days to remedy that breach? And if not, lock them out of the premises, terminate the lease. We need to make sure that's all stipulated, to allow the landlord to have the right to basically take back those lease premises. Another important clause in leases is the rent increases. So what method will be used to actually increase the rent? So there's a few different options. You could have CPI increase. You could have it as a fixed increase. A certain percentage, 3, 4, 5% each anniversary of the lease, or you could have it as multiple. You could have it as CPI or fixed increase, whichever is the higher one. And then if there are option periods, often it's a good idea to have that the lease will increase by market rate. So, doing a market comparison at the time of the option period being taken up to see what rent should be then. Another important key term of retail and commercial leases is what is the actual type of lease. So if it is retail or non-retail, so commercial, making sure for retail leases we've got the correct disclosure documents provided by both the lessor and the lessee. For the lessee, they've also got to make sure they provide both a financial advice report and a legal advice report, so they say that they know what they're entering into. The GST obligations and then the outgoings under the lease. So is the rent inclusive of GST? Is the rent inclusive of the outgoings? So we need to make sure we're stipulating if it is exclusive of outgoings, how is the tenant's share actually calculated? So is it a gross rent where outgoings have been included, or is it rent plus outgoings? Or is it that the tenant's paying a certain percentage based on their floor area of the premises towards those outgoings? We need to include in the lease security bond and personal guarantees. So how is the security bond actually being paid then? Do we allow them to pay it by cash or bank guarantee? And will there be personal guarantees? As a landlord, we want as much security as we can. So if there is a company entering into the lease, we want to make sure that they've personally guaranteed the lease as the directors of the company. Maintenance and repair obligations is a big one. We need to make sure that we're stipulating who will actually be responsible for what. So generally as the landlord, they're going to be responsible for the actual commercial capital repairs to the property, and the tenant will be responsible for things, like faulty replacing light bulbs and tap washers and things like that. Now, when considering entering in, like drafting a lease, what we need to be reviewing is, assessing who is the tenant and what their obligations and rights are. We need to be verifying the rent, the outgoings, the incentives, and also looking at any arrears that they're in. What are the termination provisions as well for the lease? And also the service history of the equipment. The air conditioners, they're always a big thing. Things go wrong with air conditioning units. We need to make sure that they've been properly serviced, because often that responsibility falls onto the tenant to then keep going. So we need to make sure it's all up to date at the time of the new lease starting. Now, with leases, as I mentioned, often one of the key causes is the security. So that can include, lease guarantees and also deposits. So landlords will often require financial security to protect themselves if a tenant fails to meet their lease obligations, typically through either a bank guarantee, personal guarantee, or security deposit. Now, bank guarantees, this is when the bank or financial institution, which I'm sure Adrian can assist with, will agree to pay actually the specified amount in the event of default by the tenant. So the bank guarantee should be unconditional and only expire after the obligations are fulfilled and issued by an actual Australian bank. Now, personal guarantee, so this is a guarantee coming from a third party, generally the director of the company or directors, if there's multiple, and that is if the tenant breaches the lease, they will be personally liable. So a personal guarantee should be given by someone with the asset that would allow for the breach to actually be remedied. And lastly, the security deposit. So this is similar to a bank guarantee, but paid in cash, and it's held by the landlord as security. So they might be paying, 2 months rent in advance, at all times, so that the landlord's got something to fall back on should they then become in default by not paying the appropriate rent amount when due. So essentially that's it for me. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea into, purchasing commercial property, what to be aware of, what special conditions to be included in the contract, making sure we get the right entity. And then, if there is a lease as part of that commercial property that we're purchasing, make sure that we've reviewed that, aware of the key terms. And then if we come time to renewing that lease, what we need to make sure that we're the main terms and clauses we've got included to make sure we protect ourselves, as the landlord in terms of, like I mentioned here, the lease guarantees, the deposit, security deposit, all of those things. So I'll pass over now to Adrian to talk us through, how we go about actually getting finance then to purchase that commercial property, or maybe we need assistance with the finance as a tenant if we're entering into, a big lease and need some assistance there. So thank you for that, Adrian.
Perfect. Thanks, Kaylee. That was fantastic. If we just go to the next slide. Perfect. So I feel like this is probably something that doesn't get touched on a lot. So if you're a business that is looking to enter a lease, what the actual capital requirement is to enter that lease. So as Kaylee was saying, commercial leases are very tailored to each property. It's not just a standard kind of residential lease where pretty much it's copy and paste. So every commercial lease is very different to every single property. So what we recommend is straight away try and engage a solicitor as soon as possible, just so that your negotiations with the lease are essentially going through the right, channels rather than going back and forth just with the landlord. So that's probably the main thing, is trying to get your solicitor engaged as soon as possible. So it's very important to obviously understand who's paying the outgoings, the land tax, property management fees, and everything as such. But then also understanding, your fit out incentives, your rent-free periods, and what that looks like. But then also going on to, the capital requirements. So the first thing is, that security deposit, as Kaylee was saying, is, so with the bank guarantee, essentially the way that it works is you either have the cash, let's just say it's 3 months of rent, that gets put into a term deposit, and the bank holds that term deposit and you can't touch that for that specified term. And so if you obviously fall short on rent and the landlord needs to exercise that bank guarantee, they can simply take that piece of paper of the bank guarantee, hand that into a branch, and essentially it's a check. So they can exercise and get those funds if they require, if that was to happen. Obviously, there would be a bit of back and forth between your solicitors before it actually got to that, but essentially it is a slip that the landlord can essentially exercise that right. So that's usually at least, I'd say, 2 to 3 months is what we see most commonly. And then from there, I guess the capital fit out requirements. So with commercial property, usually it's just a blank canvas. So you go into the premises and you have to fit out the premises as your needs are for the business. So obviously if you're running a service-based business like a cafe, potentially you need to fit out the premises so that it's, in a working order where you can run the cafe, right? Um, so that capital requirement can be quite large, depending on how, I guess, specky you want the fit out to be. You can obviously spend a lot of money on that fit out, and then I guess post lease is then your working capital requirement as well. So obviously you've just paid the bank guarantee, which is 3 months. You've just started the fit out, which again could be quite expensive as well. And now you've actually got to run the business. So it's quite a large capital requirement to enter into, a commercial property. It's not just like a residential lease where, you pay your bond and then you're often good for the next, year or so. So just something to take into account, because a lot of people, what we find is, they have a business already and they might be running it from home. And now they want to expand, but they don't actually understand what's required or what capital they actually need. From a financing point of view, we can assist with the term deposits and the bank guarantees. Um, there is options where you can actually use security for the bank guarantees instead of providing cash. So, for example, if you've got a residential property, you can, use that as security instead of putting cash up, or you can put in cash that gets sat in a term deposit. You get paid interest on the term deposit, but then you also pay fees on the bank guarantee. So it kind of evens out. Usually it's depending on, I guess the rates at the moment will depend on, whether you're slightly higher than the fees from the bank guarantee. And then obviously from a capital fit out requirement, we can assist depending on, again, security and what industry as well your business is in. So I'll just get to the next slide. So buying an owner occupied commercial property, it's actually right now, it's probably the easiest it's ever been from a finance perspective. It used to be quite a hard and fast rule where it was just a standard 30% deposit plus costs, which end up being about 36% with all your costs included. But now the banks are becoming a lot more, they are becoming a lot more, I guess, lenient with what they're providing from a policy perspective. So we can actually go up to 80%, sometimes even 90%, but you will have certain lenders' mortgage insurance requirements or risk fees once you go above that 80%. And some lenders are now also doing 105%, so 100% plus your costs, like your stamp duty, your solicitor's costs, and whatnot. And so all that really looks like is essentially additional security. So they do require additional security there, again, if it's another residential property or potentially another commercial premises that you may have as well. So in certain circumstances, we can fund the entire thing, but it just depends on your personal position and what that looks like. And so with the serviceability, so there's a couple of ways that we can look at it from, I guess, a full doc perspective. So with full doc, the way that it is they essentially assess either 1 to 2 years, depending on the bank. They assess your entire financial position from individually to the business, to make sure that you're able to afford the repayments. If you're already operating out of a premises and the lease is ending, we can look at adding the rent back into servicing. But the thing that we do need to take into account is that if you're leasing a premises already, are you actually paying the outgoings, or are the outgoings being paid by the landlord? Because if you're going from a lease where you're not paying the outgoings and you're now going to be paying the outgoings, we need to look at, I guess, shading the rent a bit to include those outgoings going forward. Um, and then we've got low doc options. So what low doc means is essentially limited financial documents providing to the bank. So you might include, say, BAS statements, account declarations, or business bank account statements. And so essentially the banks are allowing you to proceed on this basis, but you're essentially providing lower financial documents to get through for the application. So the difference between both those options is with full doc, you'll be able to get higher loan to value ratios, so less of a deposit, and potentially lower interest rates. Whereas low doc, your loan to value ratios will be less and your interest rates will be higher because the risk is greater to the bank. But also, if you're something else to think about as well is if you're a service-based business, again, if you're, let's say, a restaurant, you're operating out of a certain lease in a certain area. If you're moving your business from one location to another location, how is that actually going to affect your business operations and your customer base? So, just something to take into account. The banks are going to actually ask these questions. It's a lot more detailed than you'd expect from a credit point of view because they want to understand how your business will be affected post settlement and whether that's going to be interrupted as far as an income point of view. Are you going to expect a downturn in revenue? What does that look like? So it's just understanding, I guess, from a business point of view, but also a financial point of view, how this change is going to affect your overall business. And we'll just change the slide. Thanks, Kaylee. Perfect. So again, what entity do you purchase the property in? Kaylee spoke about this before. Have a chat to your accountant, have a chat to Kaylee, understand, what structure it needs to be from the get-go because you don't want to go, 5 years down the track where you have to change the entity, you pay stamp duty again. It's going to be a very costly experience. So you just need to take your time to make sure that you are structuring it in the right entity. Some of the common themes that we see, I guess, in finance is that you'll have a trading business here and then you'll have a property holding entity here. So there's just a bit of a line of separation because if you essentially have your commercial property in the trading business, what happens is if the business goes into liquidation, then your commercial property is essentially on the line. Whereas if it's in a separate property holding entity, there's just a bit of a line of separation. So from that point of view, obviously get Kaylee's opinion on what the best structure is, but we usually see a degree of separation between the two, just for the liability recourse more than anything. We also see self-managed super fund commercial properties as well. That's quite common. So essentially, your trading entity is then paying rent to your super at market rent because of the SMSF regulations. Again, lower tax environment in your super, but again, leave it to the experts. Make sure that you're buying in the right entity from the start because it will be a costly experience going forward. So that's that one. Perfect. So I guess commercial property investing, why do people go down this route and why? So one of the main benefits of commercial property is the cash flow. So for example, you'll find that in commercial property, the yields might be around 5 to 7%, but that's a net yield. Whereas in residential property, you're probably looking at about 3 to 4%, but that's gross yield. So in residential, obviously you pay all the outgoings as the landlord, whereas in a commercial property, sometimes depending on the lease, you can essentially have the outgoings paid by the tenants. So one of the main benefits is also having much longer leases. So as Kaylee was saying before, is you can have, say, a 3-year lease with 2 options for 3 years. So at the end of the first 3 years, you can have the option to extend for another 3 years and then again another 3 years for that as well. And the benefit of that as well is that you can have increases year on year on the lease. So you could either have a fixed percentage or CPI, or you can have, whatever's greatest for that year, so that your income is growing year on year and it's not just stagnating across, say, a 9-year period. So that's one of the major benefits, the longer tenancies. And then the other thing is, I guess, a bit of a unicorn that some people speak about is the triple net leases. So with the triple net leases, essentially the way that it works is you've got the tenant that pays the rent, they pay the core property expenses, they pay the real estate taxes, the building insurance, and then also the common area maintenance. So those are a bit of a unicorn, and a lot of people try and chase those kind of properties because essentially that net yield that the selling agent is talking about is the net yield. So it really comes down to the due diligence on the lease. Again, you really need to engage a solicitor to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, because some people, again, the sales agent might say X, Y, and Z, but then you actually go through the lease and there's a clause on page 100 pretty much eliminating exactly what he said. And you also find, unfortunately, some of the sales agents don't actually go through the leases with a fine-tooth comb. So what they say is definitely not gospel. So make sure that you engage a professional once you've found a property that you are interested in. So I guess that leads to, what are the risks? So we usually find the barrier to entry is a lot higher when you're getting into a good quality asset. Usually with commercial property, what we kind of recommend is trying to get into an asset that it's at least, 1.5 to 2 mil worth, just because once you're into the lower level kind of asset, below a mil or even below 1.5, there's just so much risk involved with getting into those assets because of the vacancy periods. Just before, I saw something from just a video on LinkedIn, and essentially they were talking about a commercial client who purchased an asset that had a net 6% yield, bought it for 800K. The tenant moved out 18 months after settlement, and then they couldn't actually re-tenant that property for a whole year. And essentially had to let the property go for 700K instead of 800K on what they bought it for. And again, it just comes back to due diligence, because that lease that's in place isn't guaranteed for the life of the asset. So your lease could be way above market rent, and then once that tenant leaves, you're now having to essentially find a new tenant, but it's going to go down to market rent. So when you're purchasing these assets, you need to make sure that, yes, the lease is tip top, but what happens after that lease? Because the tenant's not going to stay there forever. So you need to make sure that you do your due diligence to make sure that, market rent is going to be what it is after the tenant moves out, to essentially protect yourself. And so with these lower level assets in commercial property, you'll find that, a lot of small businesses will be occupying those properties. And with, I guess, the current climate, a large, high percentage of small businesses fail within the first 12 to 24 months. So it just provides a lot of risk. And then on top of that, the vacancy periods are a lot longer. So if you've got a mum and dad investor buying into commercial property, you have to feel comfortable and be in a position where potentially you've got a 12-month period where you have no tenant at all. And that's obviously one of the major risks, which is why we always say, look, when you're getting into commercial property, we'd always recommend trying to go into that higher end so that you have, better quality tenants, and you've got essentially more of a metro location. Again, if you're buying in regional locations, the risk is just greater because finding tenants for that exact location is just more difficult. So that's probably the main thing. And then also the larger capital requirements. So for commercial property, again, in the investing side, you realistically need to put in at least 30% plus costs. And there's a few ways that we can kind of structure it from a finance point of view. But yeah, the minimum required is usually around that 30% plus cost. So it is a large capital requirement to actually get into it. And I guess the main question is, when is the right time to actually invest in a commercial property? So we kind of talk to a lot of our clients on just the journey of investing and what that actually looks like. So what happens is a lot of our clients, from the start, and they, listen to a lot of podcasts regarding, passive income. I want to earn X, Y, and Z passive income to retire. What does that actually look like? And so, commercial property is great as a cash flow asset and a great way to kind of park your money in an asset class. But the thing is, you need to be able to essentially generate wealth to get to that point. So a lot of our clients will generate their wealth through residential property. They make their money, they offload assets at the right point of time. And then when they're ready to go into more of a cash flow asset and park their funds, that's when they'll go into commercial property, because then they're getting, say, 5, 6, 7% net yield, and they're getting that passive income. Whereas in residential property, it's never going to be a cash flow asset. It's all about the capital kind of growth. And that's something that I guess commercial property isn't. It's not a large capital growth play. What you'll find is residential property will provide capital growth, and then potentially once that suburb or once that LGA has increased by X amount, potentially, the commercial property value is, slowly going to increase. But the main value associated with a commercial property is the lease. So if you've got a really strong lease in place and it's for a long term, and you've got really quality tenants like ASX listed tenants like Pet Barn or Supercheap, that's where the value is. It's not actually to do much with the land site. It's all about the lease. So we'll just go to the next slide, please, Kaylee. Thank you. So I guess getting onto the finance side, again, we've got three options. Full doc will just be a full assessment, taking into account your individual situation, taking into account any other entity that you may have involved for essentially investing or potentially other businesses. So they'll take into account probably at least 12 months of your financial position, potentially 24, depending on the bank. I guess, positive of going down a full doc pathway is that you will have cheaper rates and you will have higher LVRs. So you'll be able to put in less of a deposit, because you're providing more income documentation to the bank, which essentially resulting in less of a risk to the bank. Second option is then having that low doc option, which again is limited financial documents. So you've got accountant's deck, you've got BAS, or you've got business account statements if you run a business. So again, it's more risk to the bank because you're providing less information to them. So that results in lower LVRs and higher rates. And then for commercial investment properties, it's got this third option called a lease doc option. So with the lease doc option, they're essentially assessing your financial position purely based on the lease. So the loan assessment isn't taking into account any of your business or taking into account your individual circumstances either. So what we usually find sometimes is our clients will kind of maximize themselves in a residential portfolio, and then potentially they might be very asset heavy but cash flow poor. And so they might get into a commercial property because they have that lease doc pathway, and they're just assessing the lease and they're not assessing your personal or business financial circumstances. So essentially, if you offloaded a property, you could then use those funds, go down that lease doc pathway and continue investing. So with the lease doc pathway, what they do look at is a couple of things, being interest cover ratio, as well as weighted average lease expiry. And so with the interest cover ratio, it can be between 1.25 times or 1.5 times, or potentially even more, depending on the bank. And all that means is the lease income is covering the interest by X amount. And so with interest rates at the moment being, for commercial, you're probably looking around your sevens, potentially low six, mid to high sixes. And essentially what that means is the loan to value ratio is mainly going to be around that 50 to 55%. Now, some of the banks will do up to 65 to 70% on that lease doc option, but the issue is the income won't meet those metrics. So that's going to result in the debt being a lot lower and not up to those standards. So for example, let's just say in 5 years' time, then with the interest rates reducing, you're going to be able to get higher loan to value ratios because of that interest cover ratio. With the weighted average lease expiry, the way that works is essentially if you've got, let's say, 2 tenants, one tenant has a 5-year option and one tenant has a 2-year option, your average between those will be, let's just say, 3.5. And so some banks will want you to have the loan term up to, say, 3 years to allow you to essentially renew, the lease for another, let's say, 3 or 4 years. So just kind of depending on how you've structured the loan term as well as the leases will depend on how comfortable the banks are going to be to essentially provide as far as loan term. So with the loan terms, the amortization will usually be over 15, potentially 30 years, depending on how it's structured, but the loan term itself might only be 3 or 4 years. So essentially at the end of the 3 or 4 years, they'll just make sure that a new lease is in place, income still covering the loan itself, and then they'll renew it for, say, again, another 3 or 4 years, depending on what that loan term is. One of the main reasons for that is obviously the risk to the bank. They want to make sure that there's income coming in, but it's also to do with the capital required for the bank. So for them to allocate capital for over 30 years is a lot more expensive compared to allocating capital for, say, 3 or 4 years. So it's actually cheaper for the bank. So you get cheaper interest rates for, say, a shorter term compared to, a 30-year term, but you, again, don't have those 3 or 4 review periods. So you kind of got to work out whether you're happy paying, the higher rate for the longer term or whether you're happy to go through those reviews every 3 or 4 years. So that's pretty much it from a finance point of view. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Adrian. A lot of information there for people that are looking to invest in commercial property or needing, capital required for a commercial retail lease. So appreciate that and going through some of those options. We'll open it up now. If there's any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute. Otherwise, pop it in the chat bar. I'll just give a couple of minutes to see if there's anyone that pops up in the chat, and we'll go from there. Right, I can't see anyone type or anything. If you do have questions and you don't want to ask them in the public forum, feel free to reach out to Adrian or myself. Our contact details are up there. I'm more than happy to do an obligation-free consultation with you to discuss your commercial property purchase, or if you're looking to enter into a new lease. And obviously, I'm sure Adrian will be happy to offer the same service, but in terms of the finance requirements and where you're at with the finance side. Appreciate you joining us today, Adrian.
Thank you, Jade.
Sharing all your knowledgeable information. And for those that have attended today, we'll also send out a recording of today's webinar along with a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and we'll likely reach out to you as well to try and see if we can help you further. But thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Property Power Talks. We hope you found today's insights valuable and engaging. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. For more information or to connect with our expert team at MB Property Law, then please visit our website at noborderslawgroup.com.au. We look forward to having you join us next time for more expert advice and actionable strategies to master the world of property law. Until then, stay informed and stay empowered.